if when you leave the room, you ruminate over what just happened and you play what just happened over and over again in your head, your brain then thinks, because the memory of it is so recent, the memory, the imaginary experience of it that you're triggering by ruminating on it is so vivid that your brain thinks that stress response and that conversation is still carrying on. And so it keeps pressing on the stress response button. And it will keep doing so until you stop ruminating. And this is why a great practical tip is the moment you've had an acute stress response, never relax. Empty the mind. Don't do that. Do the opposite. As soon as you do that, it breaks the circuit.
Dr. Mithu, you're very welcome to the ScaleX Insider podcast. Really delighted and thrilled to be speaking with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we had a wonderful conversation before we came on. Some of that we'll get into today. I open up with the same question to all of our guests, and I'd like to pose the question to you, Dr. Mithu. Our vision is to inspire, connect, and enable millions of ambitious leaders of small to medium-sized enterprises to scale with purpose. So what does scaling with purpose mean to you?
Scaling with purpose to me means venturing into the unknown, meeting uncertainty head on, and doing what explorers of the past did today, but in the realm of business ideas.
I love that. And we're going to get into that because it's often the venturing into the unknown that impedes business leaders from actually scaling. And I was sharing with you before we came on, less than 1% of small to medium-sized enterprises in the UK alone currently achieve scale. And I really want to lean on your work today to see if we can nudge some of those 99% who aren't scaling to scale. But before we do that, I'm always curious to understand what inspires guests who have authored a book as to why they have written the book. I have your wonderful book here, Stress Proof, the ultimate guide to living a stress-free life, which certainly business leaders will want to get a copy of this. What inspired you to write it, Mithu?
Thank you. Thank you for getting the book. I have encountered stress, I'd say, for pretty much all my life, like many people, but I encountered it through several different routes. And I think the last route is what acted as a catalyst to write the book. So very briefly, I encountered stress as part of my work, as part of my career. When I was a medical student, I was very type A. I was one of those people who was much more affected by a situation than the next person. And, I dealt with it and I thought, well, it's just me. So I had the usual negativity and stress burden of anyone else doing my kind of job. And then I met stress from another angle, which is I encountered a huge range of illnesses, both within neurology and within ophthalmology, so to do with the brain and to do with the eyes, where there are many situations, many occasions where the patient would have, say, for instance, a chronic inflammatory condition and with relapses, and the patient is doing everything correctly, but there's been a relapse. So you ask the patient, did anything happen? What can you find a reason why this might have happened? And inevitably, the answer has always been stress. But for the last few decades, it's been almost impossible to measure stress in an objective way. So it was never really part of the clinical equation. And that's something that really fascinated me over the years. I mean, two little examples that I'll share with you. In ophthalmology, so in eye surgery, we encounter a condition called CSCR, central serous chorioretinopathy, where people are completely fine and suddenly they develop a coin-sized blur in the center of their vision. And no one knows why, so they come to see us. And when we look into their eyes, we find a little bit of fluid gathering under their retina in that very spot. And this is a condition which most eye doctors will encounter or will have encountered quite frequently in what we call eye casualty, the emergent A&E for eyes. And when patients come to us and you diagnose it, but when, for many years, when we looked at the cause was really unknown. And this condition actually first was widely written about, and its connection to stress was made following the Second World War, where many patients were found to have, well, many people were found to have this kind of post-traumatic condition. So over the years, a link developed between having this condition and having a so-called type A personality. But again, there was a great big question mark. So it's only relatively recently that we now know that actually there is a correlation between this condition and the hormone cortisol, which, as you know, is associated with stress. So this is one of many examples. Another example is if patients have diabetes and they're on insulin and they're doing everything right, they're on the diet they should be on, taking the insulin when they should be taking it, living exactly how they should be living, but they come to their doctor and they say, my sugar is still spiking. And then you probe a little further and you find out that actually it's being triggered by stressful events. So it came at me from that angle as well, because it was something that was clearly there, but it was not objective enough for us as clinicians to do something about. And then we moved to Hong Kong about a decade ago, my husband and I, for his work. And Hong Kong is the most fast-paced city I have ever lived in. People don't work or live in Hong Kong time. They work or live in New York time and London time combined. So it's a city that never sleeps. And the burden of chronic stress is very heavy. And when I saw it all around me, that's what inspired me to really look at the literature and see what is known about this, what is known now about this compared to 2 decades ago. And I found a huge wealth of papers, a lot of information that I was not aware of, and that turned into a book.
Well done, you. And it's packed full of practical things that we can do, and we're going to get into some of that. But you had me engaged in the very first few pages with your reference to Wim Hof. I'm a huge fan of everything that Wim is doing. I became an instructor in the last couple of years, and I met Wim now on a number of occasions. He has a wonderful scaling mindset, and I think, I often reference on this show that we can learn a lot from the way he conducts himself, the way he lives his life. What inspired you to cite Wim Hof in a book about stress?
Well, ultimately, a stress reaction is an adaptation gap between you and the world around you. And it's an adaptation gap that's perceived by your brain. And throughout your day, day-to-day basis, you will have many such small adaptation gaps, which your brain automatically adjusts your body to, your body's physiological and mental parameters to. And the way it does this is by this incredible nerve network buried inside us called the autonomic nervous system. And as an aside, and I write about this in my book, one of the big pioneers of work in the autonomic nervous system was another great athlete, or a great self-control expert, Sir Roger Bannister, the late Roger Bannister, who ran the 4-minute mile. And after running the 4-minute mile and running in heat, he became very interested in the autonomic nervous system, and he wrote an amazing book, which most neurologists have a copy of. But so his work on the autonomic nervous system is immense, but essentially the autonomic nervous system is this automatic nerve network that is very much like a seesaw. And if you imagine a seesaw, so actually it has 3 parts, but if you focus on two of the main arms of the autonomic nervous system as a seesaw, the seesaw is usually kept straight by the brain. Every time you have an adaptation gap, one end of the seesaw is pushed down. So as an example, if you're lying down in the morning, you wake up in the morning after a good night's sleep and you stand up. The moment you stand up, the blood pressure that you have when you're lying down has to rise to compensate for gravity's pull. Otherwise, your brain's blood supply momentarily diminishes. So when you're lying down and from getting up after having, even if you lie down actually for just a few minutes, it doesn't matter how long you've been lying down. So after getting up from lying down, when you do that, your brain there's an adaptation gap of the blood supply your brain needs compared to the blood supply it will get if nothing changes. And the autonomic nervous system pushes down on the seesaw, one end of the seesaw, which is actually the end that is also responsible for the stress response, the fight or flight end of the seesaw, pushes that down. That raises your blood pressure slightly, raises your heart rate slightly, and you now are perfectly adapted to standing compared to lying down. Then, if you do the opposite, if you lie down having stood up, your brain again senses an adaptation gap and it pushes down on the opposite end of the seesaw, on the parasympathetic end, or what we refer to as the rest and digest end. That lowers your blood pressure, lowers your heart rate, and when you're lying down, you have just the right amount of blood perfusion going to your brain. So these little adjustments, and I've cited lying down and standing up, but this happens constantly when you're running after a bus, after standing at a bus stop, etc., etc. So these little adjustments are essentially adjustments that your brain makes to adaptation gaps, and they're made via this automatic nerve network known as the autonomic nervous system. It pushes on one end if it wants things to kind of fire up, heat up, or speed up, and it pushes at the other end if it wants things to slow down. And this is a very roundabout way of answering your question about Wim Hof. We know that the autonomic nervous system is pushed down a little too much towards the kind of the speeding up acceleration end, which also leads to the stress response, so the fight or flight end, which we call the sympathetic end. And this tilting of the seesaw that way is unfortunately an inevitable consequence of the kind of the knowledge work world that we live in, the urban, fast-paced world that we live in. And so practices that push the seesaw the other way, so to level the seesaw again, are now becoming increasingly more and more popular. And many people have, one way of looking at it is a sluggish seesaw. So it tilts in one direction, but it doesn't come back to the straight baseline quite as easily. And we're now discovering that practices such as breathing, practices such as heat exposure can help tone this autonomic regulation of the seesaw. And this is what brings me to Wim Hof. He, as far as I know, has done an amazing range of work relating to breathing, relating to cold exposure. And I cite one of his studies on influencing the immune response by modulating his autonomic nervous system through breathing and cold exposure. Um, Another angle to it that Wim Hof demonstrates is that this automatic nerve network also feeds into our immune regulation and our immune system, and as well as to pretty much everything else. So digestion is regulated by it, our immune system is regulated by it, and of course our day-to-day cognitive functioning is regulated by it. But yes, Wim Hof shows a really brilliant demonstration of how you can tone the autonomic nervous system by carrying out these practices and how that can ultimately influence your immune response.
I love that. And the study that you were citing, Mithu, was the Rad Boots study, and it was the first time that the scientific community had actually confirmed that what was believed up until that point, that we couldn't influence our autonomic nervous system. As the name suggests, it was automatic. We don't think about controlling our heart or thinking we have to breathe. It happens automatically. And that study confirmed through Wim's practice, a practice steeped in ancient traditions, that we could actually influence our autonomic nervous system, which has significant impacts, beneficial impacts to our overall health and well-being, reducing actually pro-inflammatory markers and increasing those anti-inflammatory markers. So without getting overly technical on the scientific side, it's his work is profound, both in terms of the profound impact that the method can have, and it's really simple. It's through the breath work. Just picking up on that before we dive into the deeper into the book, I'd love to get your opinion, the medical opinion, on the benefits, because often I recommend to people the cold exposure and they look at me with this kind of blank stare thinking, he's crazy. I'm not going to expose myself to cold showers. I don't see the benefits. Can you cite the benefits of cold therapy? And this is something, one of the pillars, obviously, of the Wim Hof method.
So, first of all, you're if you are crazy, then you are just as crazy as Charles Darwin, because actually Charles Darwin, a very long time ago in the 19th century, a couple of English doctors went over to Germany, and they discovered a very long German tradition of, I think the German word is Wasserkur, the water cure or the water course. And it was very widely practiced in Germany, what was then Germany and Switzerland and that sort of area. And they brought the practice back to England, to Malvern. And they opened this water cure center in Malvern, where they offered treatments such as steam rooms. So they obviously couldn't, there was no kind of construction for a sauna at the time, but they offered hot steam baths, and they offered ice cold baths and ice cold showers. And Charles Darwin, after his trip on HMS Beagle, his mind was clearly on fire, but it clearly had some kind of consequence on his physical well-being, because when he returned, he was plagued with a lot of illness, which most doctors at the time could not solve. So he went to this water cure center, and he wasn't alone. Florence Nightingale was another frequent visitor, as was Alfred Lord Tennyson. But Charles Darwin is the scientist, so he went there several times, and he found that the whole water therapy actually really, really helped him. And he wrote about it, and there are lots of personal private letters to his relatives where he writes how he found it incredibly beneficial, and he's so-called cured. Of course, we don't know if he really was cured or not, but subjectively he felt cured. And he said, people call this quackery, but I know for sure, I've been there, it isn't any such thing. And of course, at the time, there was very little science to kind of support the idea of doing it. But Charles Darwin would agree with you for sure.
I think that's the first time I've been referenced to Charles Darwin in the same sentence.
But I mean, coming back to the science of it. So I think if we were to be very strict and look at the medical literature, there is a lot of literature on sauna therapy. And in a way of speaking, so if we just step back a little bit and come back to the autonomic nervous system. So one of the key roles of the autonomic nervous system is to regulate body temperature. So when you heat up, your sympathetic nervous system kicks in and cools you down. And the opposite happens, and the sympathetic nervous system actually does play a role also in heating you up in the first place. It actually plays a very dual role, so following an ice bath and so on. But temperature regulation is a very important arm of the autonomic nervous system. And there is data that primarily relates to heat, but there is some data also on kind of heating and cooling that suggests that doing this can or seems to improve autonomic regulatory markers, so things like heart rate variability and so on. So there is certainly emerging evidence. Unfortunately, this has not been very well studied for decades and decades, despite Charles Darwin's praise of it. So we're only really just learning about it. But this whole thermoregulation is really played out by the autonomic nervous system. I mean, in a very general way, our autonomic nervous system actually shifts as the seasons change. So there is a parasympathetic dominance in winter, there is a sympathetic dominance in summer, and these shifts are also correlated with our immune regulation and so on. So there is certainly emerging evidence to suggest that playing with thermoregulation has a very important role in autonomic well-being. Another angle I'd bring to it is one of the other tools that Wim Hof uses is breathing. And he, for instance, I'm not probably such an expert as you are, but I'm aware that he uses breathing to modulate his autonomic nervous system when he's in the bath, in the ice bath, and recovering thereafter. And this is actually a very interesting area where there is quite a lot of research emerging at the moment. I've cited some, but I think one of the most interesting has emerged relatively recently, and it relates to a center in the brain called the pre-Bertzinger nucleus complex, which is the part of the brain that regulates the rate of breathing. So it's a pacemaker for breathing. Now, there's another part of the brain called the locus ceruleus, which is the headquarters of your sympathetic half of the autonomic nervous system within the brain. So it is the headquarters of noradrenaline within the brain, of the noradrenergic circuits. So when activity in the locus ceruleus increases, alertness and kind of physiological arousal increases. So it's a kind of a very active hypervigilant state. And when it decreases, the opposite happens. Now, what scientists, I think they're from the California-based research group, have discovered, first in mice, and then they've corroborated their findings in humans, is there is a direct nerve pathway that links this pre-Bertzinger complex that sets the pace of breathing to the locus ceruleus, which is the headquarters of your brain's sympathetic nerve network. And hence, by lowering the rate in one, you can lower the activity in the other. And as far as I know, I think they published a paper where they named these neurons, the pranayama neurons, in homage to the old yogic practice of using pranayama breathing to control uh, the autonomic nervous system, to control, to create, or to induce relaxation, and so on.
It's fascinating, and we could spend the next couple of hours speaking about just on breath control and cold exposure alone. And just to tie that back, you mentioned the spike in noradrenaline when we get into the cold, and certainly what we understood is that that helps to reduce inflammation and allow the release of serotonin, which is the feel good, which is why when you have a cold shower, as much as you have that little inner voice, the we activate the sympathetic response, the fight or flight response, to get to hell out of that shower. If you stay within there, you will always come out of the cold feeling more alert, as you mentioned, Mitsu, more focused, more attentive, and you will always feel better. No one ever comes out of the cold going that I don't feel better. You always feel much more energized, more refreshed, and there's chemical reasons for that, as you've referenced. And we take our CEOs through within our ScaleX Accelerator program through the Wim Hof method as a practice to help them develop resilience. And we'll get into it in your book, to develop resilience, because we use actually the ice bath, not only in terms of the physiological benefits it brings, but it's also a wonderful metaphor for scaling a business, because you must get comfortable with being uncomfortable when you go on that scaling journey. So the very first principle of our ScaleX framework is psyche. And when we really focus on, if you're healthy of body, then ultimately it builds a better foundation for being healthy of mind. And when you're healthy of mind, you're much more predisposed then, are in a better place to begin contemplating the scaling journey. And as we referenced at the outset, scale ups are so critically important for our communities, our societies, and our economies. But I want to bring this back. So I'm going to start actually in chapter 9, because the second principle of our ScaleX framework is purpose and vision. And there's something, and I wasn't aware of this, is paradoxical. You cite this study about 2 decades ago. The world of brain science uncovered an interesting paradox, and what we would expect that the brain of a person with his feet up thinking of nothing and doing nothing would work less hard than the cerebral matter of a mathematician trying to solve an impossible equation. And what it turns out is that essentially what you now call the default mode network is that when we're focused on a long-term goal and lean into that, our brain is less active. Essentially, we get into that flow state, and than whenever actually we don't have those long-term goals or vision to focus on. The paradox is that actually the brain is much more active when we don't. Can you? I have plagiarized what you've referenced there in chapter 9. Can you speak more eloquently as to the importance of purpose and vision in relation to actually calming the mind rather than actually overstimulating the mind?
There are so many, but let's start with what I've written in the book. So very, very generally, there is so we are essentially machines, or well, we're not really machines at all. That's a terrible thing to say, but we are like machines in a sense, in that we are not really aware of the world around us, but we are getting cues coming in from the world through our sense organs. And the brain is creating an imaginary picture of what it thinks the world looks like. And, a great example of this is we can't see infrared light because we have no infrared receptors, but that doesn't mean infrared light doesn't exist. Okay, so we can only see a small amount of the world around us, but we are creating a map of it and a map of reality to guess what the world around us looks like, because we need to know what the world around us looks like in order to be able to predict what's around the corner. So we create this image of the world, this kind of map of the world, this model of reality in our heads, and then we constantly test it. We test it with hypothesis testing. So we make predictions that, okay, that car just disappeared, it's going to appear again. And it has appeared again. Okay, so we make kind of predictions, and we check that those predictions are correct. If they're incorrect, we tweak our model. We get more data, we tweak our model and improve it. And we keep doing this all the time. Now, part of this this creation of a model of reality really involves our own goals and what we are going to do next. So we know that we have some very basic needs. You may be familiar with Maslow's triangle. So we have the basic needs of food, of shelter, of safety, and so on. But then as you keep going up and as you become a human agent of your world, there is data coming in that suggests that having a sense of purpose, having a goal and a sense of coherence of your life so far and of coherence of your life projected forwards gives you a great sense of resilience and is actually even correlated to lower inflammatory markers in the long run. And you mentioned the default nerve network. So the default nerve network is really the chain of networks in the brain that run along the midline, and they involve different areas. But what we think they do is they act as a scribe of your own autobiography. So they write down what has happened, your brain's version of what has happened so far, and they use that to predict what will happen next, not just in the immediate future, but we are very gifted with this huge part of the front of our brain called the prefrontal cortex. We can imagine, we can dream, and this drives us forward. So this scribe and this default mode network creates an autobiography of yourself, which then projects forward. And this projection forward then influences and guides your behavior. And you can extrapolate so much on this. So we'll come to the business aspects in just a moment, but even more generally, there is data to suggest that people who feel confident about the future and confident about their own ability to age well actually end up living longer. Um, I mentioned that having a sense of coherence and a sense of purpose is tallied to a lower range of inflammatory markers. And I also mention in my book, actually, at the start, how anecdotally many doctors will tell you that when they meet patients who come to a crossroad, it's where it's really touch and go, life and death situation, then having a purpose, needing to live for something, a grandchild's wedding perhaps, or the cat needs to be fed at home, who will feed the cat? This kind of purpose can actually even decide whether a patient is going to survive the night. So
Wow.
it just shows you how we tend to reduce the brain and its functions. And we've learned a lot by doing this, and it's very important to do it to an extent. But in our reductionist approach to the brain, we tend to kind of eliminate things that we cannot explain. And this sense of purpose is something that we really have kind of shelved for a long time and kind of put into a box of the unknown and the kind of anecdote. But we are now realizing that this has a very real and very measurable effect on your own future trajectory. So I mentioned life and death, and if you were to scale down rather than scaling up, you can imagine how that affects your decisions in the context of business decision making, taking risks, meeting uncertainty. So, if we were to go along the path of meeting uncertainty, which is what scaling up really is to an extent, or it needs to, it encompasses that, even if it isn't that. The point with uncertainty is everyone has a certain level of uncertainty tolerance, or we call it intolerance. So, uncertainty intolerance. And uncertainty intolerance has been correlated with anxiety. So people who are anxious tend to be more intolerant of uncertainty than people who are not. And we know that if you are intolerant of uncertainty, one of the reasons is you have a negativity bias. So when you consider all the outcomes, you think more of the negative outcomes. But if we were to tie in what we just said about our autobiography, having a sense of purpose, having a sense of coherence, then you can add the two together, and people who have a sense of purpose and have a sense of achievement as well, they tend to have a more optimistic outlook of lose situations, loss centered situations. And if you were to approach a novel situation or venturing into unknown with that kind of mindset, then having that sense of purpose will actually shield you a little bit more from the intolerance of uncertainty.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and just to pick up or go a little bit deeper on that, and purpose is ubiquitous in the business world at the moment, and I'm conscious that people are kind of scrambling out to quick, let's find a purpose. And it's really important that people authentically and business leaders authentically really spend the time to understand, why they exist as an organization and why they exist in the first instance, because both should be aligned. And I always encourage business leaders to really journal on that and understand what it is that makes them get up in the morning, because that's very powerful, as I always say, to get through that wet Wednesday in November when everything seems to be going horribly wrong. Lots there are very few businesses, as we understand. I interviewed Dr. Oleg Konovalov in one of the earlier seasons at an authority on visioneering, and there are very few businesses actually who have a long-term vision of the future. But if I can make a tenuous link here, what we're saying is if you've always found business challenging and you haven't crafted a vision of the future, essentially what you're saying is that you will continue to kind of find those things that confirm your bias or your experience about business being difficult and challenging. Whereas if you craft a vision for the future and really lean into that, then your brain will hunt out things to confirm that this is a positive experience, and it will reaffirm and help, and essentially becomes self-fulfilling in many respects. Is that what we're saying here, Mithu, or am I oversimplifying this?
Absolutely. So if you were to focus on a long-term purpose for your business, which is authentic enough for your brain to really align it with your own sense of purpose, your core values, and so on, then, and if you were, as you say, to craft that long-term vision, to really, as you say, lean in, then you're going to explore that in its infinite possibilities. And those possibilities include winning and, in some cases, overcoming. And if you were to force yourself to do that, then that sense of purpose, of drive, that push to explore the unknown and its possibilities is going to nudge you towards taking a more positive view of overcoming obstacles than if you don't have that long-term vision and going through a contingency plan and were to just estimate and forecast your future trajectory based on past failures. So absolutely, if you've had a sense of past failures, then if you don't want to keep repeating the pattern, lean in, go through all your contingencies, go through the wins, go through the loss situations, and then focus on how to turn the losses into wins, so you force yourself to have a positivity bias, and that nudges you away from the intolerance of uncertainty.
Yeah, I love that positivity bias. So, just in terms of continuing to develop that positivity bias, we encourage the CEOs that we coach and who come on to our ScaleX Accelerator program, and certainly we reference this in the book. We encourage business leaders to craft their vision, certainly go out 10 years, but even nearer term with a little bit more pixelation, what we call a vivid vision, and read that vivid vision rather than listening to the news in the morning, which we know is going to be negative, like that's guaranteed. And before you go to bed at night, listening to the news, we know it's going to be negative. That's what you're going to go to sleep on. Rather than doing that, to read your vivid vision in the morning, which is a positive picture of the future, and read it in the evening. The last thing it's the last thing you do before you go to bed. Would you agree with that? And is there anything else that our leaders can do to really seed that positivity bias?
So I think it's a great idea to do that, and I completely agree. Do not listen to the news if you possibly can. I've certainly stopped doing so. I think that so with a positivity bias, I think you begin with understanding your own personality. Do you have an exceptionally high intolerance of uncertainty? Chances are, if you're a business leader, if you're an entrepreneur, you already don't. So you already are in the proportion of the population with relatively average or better levels of uncertainty intolerance. On top of that, there are a couple of things that you can do. So absolutely, throughout your day, nudge yourself into taking an optimistic view of your own life, of your future, of your business's future. And that's a great idea. Another thing to do is, and this has been shown by quite a few resilience related data, is remember remember tree has roots. So if your business and what you're doing in your daytime is of course nurturing your business, and you see your business as the branches of the trees and the trunk of the tree, the branches of the tree, the leaves of the tree, you also have all these roots this buried half of the tree that you're not looking out for, that you're not really, or always aware of or always remembering. And one of the things that really helps in resilience is taking an almost 360-degree approach to your own self. So if you are in a situation where you're starting a business and you need that kind of courage, that boldness to go forth into the unknown, having overcome challenges in your past, even if they're not related to your business, will give you a sense of self-efficacy and a confidence about you and a sense of agency as an agent in your world, which is more likely to nudge you away from a defeatist thinking and from assuming you won't be able to overcome obstacles towards feeling, okay, yes, that's been in another realm, but I've done it and I can do it here. And just winding back to what you were saying about cold exposure and heat exposure, well, one of the things you have to do when you're in that ice bath, and I know this from having done it myself, is you think you're going to die. Well, at least I did the first time I ever did it. But no, you're going to sit through it and you're going to count and you're going to breathe and you can sit through it. And once you do it the first time, you have this sense of, wow, I can really do it. And that carries forward in other domains of your life. And it's the same with heat exposure. So I did a lot of, hot yoga, and I've had that sensation actually not just the first time, but many times during my practice. But when you come out of it, there's that sense of self-efficacy. And when you then apply yourself to a different challenge, your brain, your default mode network, the autobiography that we just spoke about, that goes back through previous chapters. Have I been here before? Yes, I have. Did I think I was going to fail? Oh, yes, I did. Did I think I was going to die? Yes, I did, absolutely. But did I fail? No. And that comes through. And so I think part of being a leader and part of being an entrepreneur, especially I would think of scaling up and meeting uncertainty head on without fear, is nurturing this sense of self-efficacy, confidence, comfort. When you're sitting in that ice bath or when you're doing a challenge that's completely unrelated, a marathon if you've never run one before, or something similar, learning a new language in a new country you've never been in before, anything. It doesn't have to be in a specific domain. That sense of meeting uncertainty head on and then appreciating, yes, it's incredibly uncomfortable, but I've done it. That
Yeah,
is a very important facet of
yeah.
being in the mindset of growth.
And again, this speaks to the practices we encourage within our ScaleX Accelerator program, Psyche being the first principle, and it's a thread that's woven through our year-long program. And we talk about, there's a lot of talk in business about resilience, and so I get frustrated with that because you could, well, yeah, but how do we practice resilience? And exactly what you just referred to, Mitsu, we encourage the leaders to just to spend 15 seconds at the end of their warm shower to experience the cold, and to build that up. You build that up to 2 minutes, and the sense of achievement and accomplishment that gives you is phenomenal. And essentially you're training yourself to override the fight or flight desire to react instead of respond. And we encourage people to really focus on a long exhale, really lean into the breath with a long exhale. And it's incredible how they can train themselves, because that cold shower is akin to the difficult email from a customer to just inform you that you haven't won the tender that you were reliant upon, or a key employee who has told you that they've found employment elsewhere. Uh, the same responses are triggered within us when we receive that news as it is triggered within that environment, the difficult environment, the likes of the cold environment. So we train for resilience. We train our CEOs to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and actually then develop that strong sense of self-efficacy. So I really love that. I want to touch, just when we talk about you know, tr- you know, training and learning practices, so we can develop the boldness to go into the unknown, as you've referenced. I love that. You cite in your book, 7 routes to becoming stress proof, which is what leaders need to do essentially to gain that boldness to go into the unknown. So could you step us through those 7 routes, and give the listeners, Mithu, practical takeaways in relation to those 7 routes to becoming stress proof?
Thank you. So I'm going to preface this by saying that one huge facet of it is what we've just spoken about, training the mindset through all these different ways. Another facet of it is there is an unknown universe existing in our minds, actually existing in our brains, which are going to, and this universe sways the way we feel about the world, sways our decision making, and sways the way in which we perceive our world on a moment to moment basis. And many of these, and this kind of inner universe relates to things like inflammation, relates to your dietary nutrition, relates to many of the neuromodulators that are circulating in your brain at any one time. But essentially, we didn't know it before, but something as simple as inflammation actually changes the way you think and changes the way you perceive the world around you. The reason why chronic stress has these 7, an acute stress response actually has these 7 pathways, is because of an evolved response to the stresses that we have always encountered through our evolution. And many of us identify stress as just being, mentally kind of frazzled, distressed, emotionally distressed, and so on. But we now know that during an acute stress response, as you say, these 7 pathways happen. They're triggered by the brain. When they happen, they're there to serve us. But if you keep the pedal pushed for too long, the acute stress response becomes chronic, and they end up having non-linear effects. So very quickly to go through them. One aspect of an acute stress response, which talked about already, is you develop emotional reactivity. So your rational way of thinking about the world is momentarily suppressed, and you become very emotionally responsive. And this has an advantage, or had an advantage, because this allowed us to predict danger before it happened by emotional instinct. But of course, today, navigating a room full of people or a company full of employees, you cannot predict what another human being is saying or doing. And you cannot predict, because we know how to kind of get around emotional deceit. And you also cannot predict other people's behavior and control it. So this now serves us in a poor way. But emotional reactivity is one of these 7 arms. Along with that, a negative bias. A practical way of dealing with that is, first of all, being aware that the moment you are acutely stressed, your perception of a situation isn't as it actually will be when you're no longer in the state of stress. We know that in a state of acute stress, people make high-risk decisions. Decision making is skewed because the perception of reality is skewed. The negativity bias that happens during acute stress can sway your business decisions. So always avoiding any kind of important decisions, important evaluations while you're acutely stressed is very important for this reason.
Yeah, and again, I would add to this. We had Patrick McKeown on in one of the earlier seasons, the author of the wonderful book The Oxygen Advantage, and he's a breath expert, and there is science now and research to support this, that decision making is impacted positively when business leaders ground themselves with some slow breaths, so deep breaths into the belly and into the chest, but focusing on a very slow exhale. And again, it's something we encourage all of our leaders to practice, so that ultimately they're making decisions with the fullest part of their brain, as opposed to that kind of narrow fight or flight. Again, I'm oversimplifying, but that's what we're referring to here, Mithu, in terms of don't react to situations in that high stress moment. Ensure that you're responding and take measures to help you respond rather than react.
Correct. And remember that in that situation, your perception of reality is not what reality actually
Yes.
is.
Yeah.
And it's a very simple thing to be aware of, but most people forget, especially in the heat of the moment, when you're rushing to do things, when you have to get things done, meeting deadlines. Always, and as you say, there is a very good study, and there is actually a breathing protocol. I think it's a 452, but I will confirm that later on. If you do a 452 breathing exercise for about 15 minutes before you make a decision, that decision is more likely to be optimal. This was carried out in a laboratory where people were making decisions, and of course it's an artificial situation, but this was actually shown in a control trial. So this is a really great experiment to refer to. So
Brilliant.
yes,
Yeah, because
in
we would actually encourage our leaders to follow the box breathing protocol: 4 in, hold for 4, 4 out, hold for 4. But actually, I wasn't aware of the science and research around 452. So if you could share some of that afterward, I'll
yes,
put a
I
link in the
actually
show notes.
wrote a piece on ink for it
Brilliant.
from a couple of years ago. So
Yeah,
yeah, I'll send that over to
super.
you. So yes, controlling that is very important. The second aspect of an acute stress response, and all of these relate to each other, so they're not independent of each other. So one is very closely related to the other, is of course this first electrical autonomic nervous system and then hormonal stress response, which most people will be aware of. Now, this hormonal stress response is very important because there is this relay of hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal glands secreting hormones, which ultimately end in cortisol. Cortisol usually peaks about 20 minutes after a stress response, and we think that one of the evolved reasons for it is cortisol acts as an anti-inflammatory, so it actually numbs the inflammation that was started by sympathetic overactivity. So we know that playing with these hormones can actually change behavior, can change perception of the world, can change reactivity, can change rumination. And a really great or useful tip I'd say there is we know that the brain's perception of a stressful reaction very much is based on feedback. So it reacts and then it looks at what it has itself reacted to and produced, and then judges whether or not there is a stress reaction. What do I mean by that? So if you imagine in a workplace, you have, as you say, maybe a very bad meeting with a client or with a team member or something. But let's just say with a client. So you walk into a room, you're about to make a deal, you feel really optimistic, and then that client clearly was always set on not agreeing with you and making a very negative decision for you. So you walk into the room and you have that 15-minute conversation. That triggers a stress response. That stress response causes your brain to trigger this trio of hormones, and your brain and body are flooded by adrenaline, by all the other hormones, and lastly, by cortisol. You then walk out of the room. Now, when you leave the room, you know you've left the room. Your client knows you've left the room, but does your brain know you've left the room? The answer is no, it does not. If, when you leave the room, you ruminate over what just happened and you play what just happened over and over again in your head, your brain then thinks, because the memory of it is so recent, the memory, the imaginary experience of it that you're triggering by ruminating on it is so vivid that your brain thinks that stress response and that conversation is still carrying on. And so it keeps pressing on the hormonal, well, the stress response
Yeah.
button.
Yeah.
And it will keep doing so until you stop ruminating. And this is why a great practical tip is the moment you've had an acute stress response, never relax. If you've had a stressful experience, we tend to just take a minute out, take a moment, have a breather, have a coffee, etc., empty the mind. Don't do that. Do the opposite. And I've cited a study in the book where they took two groups of people. It was done in an experimental setting. However, they took two groups of people, put them through a mentally stressful experience. Then they took one group, let them relax on a sofa. They took the other group and made them do something even more intense. And then they measured how fast their blood pressures went back down to normal. And the group that relaxed on the sofa took the longest to recover.
So what would you recommend if we're leaving that stressful situation, or the the progress against our scaling ambition is not necessarily going to plan? What are you suggesting that we do
So
practically?
you need to cut the fuse. So how do you do that? So your perception of stress is the driver here. Your perception of reality is the driver. So if you've had a really bad meeting or a very bad stressful experience, immediately after that experience is over, so when you're free to do so, immerse your mind in something that you find immersing. So it can be anything. It could be something from playing a really immersive game on your phone, to reading something, to having a conversation with someone about something completely different. So it involves just really distracting yourself so much that your mind can no longer wander. As
Okay.
soon as you do that, it breaks the circuit. And as soon as it breaks the circuit, your brain registers that that stressful experience is over. And if you imagine over the course of a day, if you have 5 episodes of 15 minutes, or let's just say 5 episodes of 5-minute meetings, which go badly or not the way you want them to, then at the end of the day, you should really have 25 minutes of stress. But if you have 5 minutes of stress and then you come out of that room and you ruminate for another hour, then you will have had 5 hours and 25 minutes of these hormones racing through your body, and hence of the perception of a stressful experience.
Incredible. This is where we need to keep the ice bath close by.
I'm sure plunging into an ice bath would be a great way to. That's a very interesting idea. Absolutely. I mean, certainly when I plunge into an ice bath, there is nothing else that stays on my mind, for sure.
Likewise.
For sure.
Okay, so moving through then our seven, we're number four.
So next aspect of it is circadian rhythm. Now, I mentioned circadian rhythm because if you think about it, you wouldn't immediately or automatically relate a stress response to it. Circadian rhythm is your alignment with the day and night cycle of the world. Now, if you imagine yourself in this way, you have evolved, or we have all evolved, in a constant dialogue with our environment. And evolution is, in effect, a gradual improvement of adaptation to our environment. And remember, the brain cannot see what is going on around it. All it can do is create a model built on cues. So it likes cues that give it a sense of certainty. And one thing we can all be certain of, no matter what happens in the world, is that the sun is going to rise tomorrow and that the sun will set tonight. If you approach circadian rhythm and your day and night rhythm from this angle, so many aspects of your body's physiology is tied to light and darkness. And this has a very real effect on decision making, mindset, and performance on a day to day basis. Melatonin is the hormone, for instance, that we release at night in the darkness. We release it shortly before we go to sleep. So if you go to sleep when it's nice and dark, your body will start releasing it when it actually grows dark, so late in the evening. It then peaks and then it flattens off and then it goes down again when you wake up in the morning. Now, melatonin is very critical in this context because melatonin is in effect nature's anxiety pill. There is now there are now several studies that demonstrate its effect on relieving anxiety, and there's even a Cochrane review looking at melatonin and comparing it to other standard benzodiazepines, anti-anxiety pills, in a head-to-head comparison. Now, if your day and night rhythms are disturbed, so you are desperate to get things through, you are really working to a tight deadline and you're working through the night, your melatonin production will be curtailed if you're exposing your eyes to either bright light or blue light.
Yeah.
If you do that one night, then your melatonin level quota that night will be less, and the anti-anxiety effect that it will have had over your stresses, your worries that you've encountered throughout the day will be diminished, leaving you in a worse state of mind the following day.
So this is where much of the research suggests that we shouldn't go to bed with our phones. We shouldn't be exposing ourselves to this blue light last thing at night because of the disturbance, the disruption to our melatonin levels, and especially for those leaders who have aspirations to scale, where they need to be feeling confident, back to that self-efficacy. Then you want to be reducing anxiety. This is so critically important then, Mithu, in terms of just making sure you have a regularization of your circadian rhythm, and practically then, we will hear a lot about not watching TV before you go to bed, or being on the laptop or your phone, but this is the science to support it.
That's right, absolutely. And also, this in turn, remember, everything is connected. So, this in turn connects to your sleep quality,
Yeah.
levels of REM sleep and slow wave sleep that you have at night, which also act as buffers to the mental stresses and anxieties the day before. So, as an example, REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, we think animal studies show is responsible for unlearning fear memories. Okay, so if your REM sleep is disturbed during the night, you are more likely to keep hold of associations you've made between negative and AQ and a negative experience.
Well, I wasn't aware of
So,
that.
so your sleep and your night is essentially returning you to your baseline. And coming back to what I said earlier, it's very important to cultivate self-efficacy and confidence and so on. But you can't train a mind that is too weak or too inflexible to be trained. And you restore your brain's baseline every night by maintaining your circadian rhythm. Aside from the blue light at night, I also mentioned a couple of other things that you can do during your day. And this kind of upkeep is extremely important because if you're running a marathon, you know you cannot sprint too fast. Because if you sprint too fast, you're going to cause wear and tear that'll limit how far you'll be able to run and how fast. So that upkeep, that kind of slight holding back, is responsible for removing and curing or fixing all the wear and tear that you've accumulated during every day. And that is where sleep and circadian rhythm, which is tied very closely to it, become really, really important. Heat, food, light, and movement are four factors that help regulate your circadian rhythms. And aligning these with when you're most likely to be awake is one very simple way of keeping your circadian rhythm in check. So, avoiding bright light, blue light in the evening, exposing your eyes to bright light, to daylight, so not artificial bright light, but daylight, first thing after waking up, in the morning, and then ideally in segments during the day. moving all your movement to the front end of your day, so not exercising late in the evening. And there's a great study that shows, for instance, that people who exercised in the evening, when they shifted their exercise to the morning, they increased REM sleep by something like 10%. So, all these small nudges that you're making to your day-to-day habits have big impacts on your brain function and the restorative function of sleep, which then scale up to affect your own scaling up in
Yeah,
that sense.
brilliant. I love that. And there's so much in that. And actually, I was listening to Dr. Andrew Huberman recently, and he advocated something that you just referenced, which is the exposure to the sun first thing in the morning. And it's something that it's a habit that he recommends that you build into your daily practice and daily morning routine. And going out and actually looking at the sun for 15-20 minutes. And it's not something I've got into, but I certainly open the balcony door and I let the sun in the mornings.
So just to be clear, don't look at the sun, but just be
Yeah.
out in the sun.
Yeah, it's
So
interesting
never
because
look at the sun
yeah,
directly.
and it's interesting because he recommends that, and people are asking the question. But do you look at the sun? He said, well, don't stare at it, but blink, but actually, direct your attention to it. So I think that's.
So as an eye surgeon
I
myself, I would strongly suggest not looking at the sun.
yeah, and I
I
would.
mean, the point, what is very interesting with the sun is actually, so there are a couple of things here. Um, Daylight sets your circadian rhythm through a very specific group of receptors in the back of the eye called melanopsin-containing ganglion cells. And these are especially interesting to me because they were part of my research about 15 years ago when they were first discovered, actually. Shortly before that, they were discovered. These melanopsin-containing ganglion cells, we now know there are different varieties of these, but they send the message of daytime and nighttime through a different pathway to the pathways that also lead from your eye to the brain, that tell your brain what you're seeing, that form images. Okay? And this separate pathway formed by this melanopsin-containing ganglion cells, but they also feed into other things. So I'm really, really simplifying it a little bit, is responsible for setting your baseline pupil size. And for your baseline pupil size to be set, you need to be outside for give or take 45 minutes, but there is absolutely no reason for you to have to look directly at the sun. You need to be in ambient light. And some great papers on this. I mean, I would suggest looking at the work of people like Randy Carden and various others who have studied this particular pathway and the way they shape your rhythm. The problem with looking directly at the sun is it depends on where you are in terms of latitude. If you're looking at the sun in the morning at 9 o'clock, there is a very high component of blue light within it. And if you look directly at that, you will get foveal damage, which is damage to the back of the eye. So I would strongly recommend not doing it, but
Yeah,
simply being outdoors in the bright light sends your brain enough signal to change your pupillary baseline diameter, and therefore we know to give your brain the signal of daytime versus nighttime, circadian rhythm, circadian alignment.
being in Ireland, we have never any chance of looking directly at the sun because we never actually see it, Mithu. But as you'll have known, having spent some time in this part of the world, but
I mean, what's very
uh,
interesting is that at dawn, the red light quota of the sun is greater than the blue light quota, and you'll know this because that's why sunrises look really red, and it's the same with dusk. But again, it's very risky. It's certainly not something I'd recommend looking at it directly.
the so moving on, then wrapping up on the final routes to becoming stress proof, if you can just wrap the remaining
Sure. So another pathway which we haven't spoken about is, well, we have a little bit, inflammation. Inflammation is a very, very important pathway of being resilient, simply because if there's a rise in inflammatory markers in pathways of your brain, you will behave differently. And a great example of this is what we call sickness behavior. So when we become ill for various reasons, or if illness is induced in a laboratory setting in mice by introducing fragments of bacteria called endotoxin, which can leak through the gut into our blood anyway through stress, but also through day-to-day actually just eating. Um, this endotoxin goes into the blood and triggers an inflammatory reaction. And if you induce this in mice and then look at the brains of mice, so first of all, observe their behavior. So when they're inflamed, you'll find that, a very happy, free-loving, just a happy-go-lucky mouse is suddenly just become very still, has lost all motivation to do things, and, just doesn't look like a happy mouse. Now, when I say this, people say to me, what does a happy mouse look like? Or how do you know a mouse is depressed? But it's possible that, in laboratory settings, there are ways of telling. But essentially, you can change the whole behavior of the mouse by creating inflammation within the mouse. And if you now look into the brain of the mouse, which you can't do for humans, we find that actually these inflammatory markers are found and are raised in the reward pathways of the mice. And we can explain their aversion to motivation, or we can explain their absence of motivation. We can explain why they're not keen to go and play, they're not deriving pleasure, they're restricting themselves, restraining themselves from going and doing things they enjoy, can be directly correlated to these inflammatory markers that rise everywhere, including in their reward pathways. Practically, in a clinical setting, you may or may not be aware, so there are certain treatments we give patients which raise inflammation. One of these is something called interferon. When you give patients interferon, one of the things you tell them is you can feel very, very angry for a moment. Don't worry, it's normal. And that shows you just how inducing inflammation itself changes your perception of the world. The reason why this is so important is because you can modulate your levels of inflammation by watching what you eat, how you eat, and when you eat. And there's a whole load in my chapter on inflammation on that, probably too long to cover here. But essentially, there is a long list of food, or rather, a research group, first in, I think it was North Carolina, but now actually in different parts of the world, they've compiled a long list of food groups and foods specifically, which have an inflammatory index. So these foods either raise your inflammation or they bring it down. And one simple way of trying to lower your inflammation is to always include food groups in every meal that have a negative inflammatory index. And that's a very practical way of doing a simple modification to how you eat every time you eat to help address inflammation.
Yeah, and of course, our friend Wim again, through the Radwood study, he was injected with an endotoxin, and typically the 6,000 people who were part of clinical trials previous were who had been subjected to the endotoxin became quite feverish, very ill, and they had all of the symptoms of having a fever. And whilst Wim was injected with it, he practiced the breathing method and was able to resist the typical symptoms of that endotoxin, and ultimately was able to reduce the inflammation, the pro-inflammatory markers we referenced earlier on, and increase those anti-inflammatory markers. So back to the breathing protocol as well.
So that's actually very interesting, because there is actually data emerging in the context of COVID, where people or patients who are doing breathing exercises are showing positive effects, as in negative effects on their inflammatory markers, but it's a positive outcome.
Yes.
So in any situation, actually, breathing exercises have been shown to lower inflammatory markers if they're raised. So certainly you can't always predict when the endotoxin is entering your blood, but you can, practicing these breathing exercises throughout the day could be one way of transiently tackling that on a moment-to-moment basis.
Absolutely. So wrapping up then, Mitsu, anything else in relation? Well, there's lots actually. We can't cover your entire career and the detail that you go into in the book. But just finishing off then on the 7 routes to becoming stress proof before we go into our close.
So we mentioned inflammation. Another route is motivation. So when you are working very, very hard, it's very easy to shave off the things that you just do for pleasure because you think that they're just a luxury. But there is data to show that it's very important to have moments of your day when you feel pleasure, because if you stop doing that, your ability to feel pleasure itself can diminish, and that in itself affects the way you perceive the world around you.
Wow.
And there's also, I also talk about insulin resistance and how to exercise and what the correct exercise protocols are, or the best protocols are for certain instances of stress. I don't know if you'd like to quickly go over those as well.
Yeah, what would be really useful, our listeners will, I suppose, will practice lots of different exercises. Some maybe not. Others, into Ironman triathlon and everything in between. For those, let's say, time challenged entrepreneurs, business leaders who are looking for, let's say, a practice in the morning to really allow them to win the morning and ultimately win the day so they can lean into their scaling ambition, what would you recommend as a minimum?
So, as a minimum, if someone cannot exercise at all, then I'd recommend just getting up from your desk for 5 minutes every hour, ideally, or at the very least every 2 hours, and just moving. You can then upgrade to not just moving, but by doing certain resistance exercises that you can do on the spot. So, some squats, some push ups, anything like that, very minimum. Then, next grade up, if you have some time in the morning exercise is excellent for retuning, for resetting your circadian rhythm. And actually, exercising before a stressful experience can actually numb your stress response to that. There are some conflicting studies that show that this response can be mixed, and it depends on how intense your exercise was. But you have to tailor it to your own fitness level. So, voluntary wheel running in mice, which is the equivalent of just running at your, running as much as you feel like first thing in the morning, or doing any other form of aerobic exercise, to the point where it's not a punishment for you, but you actually really enjoy it every single morning, is a great way to start the day. 30 minutes minimum. Tailor it to your own fitness level, and that in itself will make a difference. If you have more time during the day, then actually there is great evidence to show that actually having moving constantly throughout the day is more effective than simply having one spurt of exercise. So I would recommend, if you're doing aerobic exercise in the morning, just at every interval you can go for a walk, keep moving, move in the daylight and in nature. Try not to exercise too late in the evening, because that heats up your body. If it heats up your body, melatonin production becomes affected, and also your REM sleep becomes affected. So I recommend shifting your exercise to the daytime. In an ideal setting, you want to be able to do voluntary, so you want to be able to do aerobic exercise as well as resistance training, which also has benefits. You talk about triathlons. Triathlons are great, but actually, I would say for another reason. Excessive exercise can indeed lead to inflammation. Too much inflammation, as we know, is bad for the brain. However, doing things like triathlon gives people a sense of self efficacy and achievement, which feeds back into the root of resilience.
Yes, I wore my very first triathlon t-shirt for a long time, so my kids would mock me and say, "Daddy, you need to change your t-shirt." But it was I was very proud of the triathlon that I completed. So I think I didn't have the language in terms of self-efficacy, but that's essentially what I was doing by wearing it. But there we go. Dr. Mithu, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast today. As is a tradition on the show, I always close with inviting our guests to share 3 timeless takeaways for our listeners.
So, first, I'd say is something I've mentioned already, which is don't forget the roots. So your tree and your leaves might be blooming in one domain, but make sure you're nurturing all the other domains as much as you can. The second thing I'd say for scaling up is, as you say, put yourself in situations that are controllable, not dangerous, that you can overcome, that are at the edge of your skill level, but don't go beyond it in order to become comfortable with uncertainty. And the third thing I'd say is there's the old saying that when you stop growing, you start dying. So the scaling up mentality within business should apply in every domain of your life.
I love those. Thank you so much for sharing your incredible experience and wisdom today on the show. If people want to find out a little bit more about you, Dr. Mithu, where best to connect with you and reach you?
So I have a Twitter account where I'm most active. I'm also on LinkedIn. I also have an Instagram account where I'm slightly less active, but you can connect with me through all these routes.
Brilliant.
There's also my website, www.myname.mithustoroni.com.
And before we close, what's next for you?
A new book. So I have a new book in the
Brilliant.
pipeline. I haven't decided on the title yet. I will let you know as soon as I know.
Well, brilliant. Well, look, we'll get you back on the show. I'd be delighted to have you on the show again to discuss your new book whenever it's launched. Can you give us is it a further exploration then on the same topic, or can you share with us what the nature of the book is about?
So it's definitely very, very related, but it's not the same. So it will be about the brain, and it will be about performance, and really looking at kind of performance in the world today and
Brilliant.
how to live better, think better, and be better.
Super. So it will certainly be applicable to the listeners of this show then who are ambitious to scale their business.
For sure, for sure. I hope so.
Dr. Mitsu, I wish you all the very best with everything that you're doing, especially the new book. Take care.
Thank you very much for having me.